Hey, welcome to episode 3 of 25 levels of cutting boards. This time we're going through boards 7 to 9, starting with a simple strips board. Now what makes this one complicated compared to before is that we're finally exploring cuts that are angled. To make it, I start out by cutting 13 ash strips, 6 of which are shorter than the full length of the board and angled at 45 degrees. This also requires miter saw tuning because the angle wasn't perfect at first. I also did the same thing with Sapelli, Purple Heart, and Paduk. Then I move on to the glue up, and here the trick is to make sure the 6 strips where there is an angled cut are slightly longer than the rest by 1 or more millimeters. That's necessary because during the glue up, you need to make sure that you clamp the sides of those pieces to force them together and get a good contact. And I do this using a piece of fur on both sides that I clamp. Once that's complete, I put it through a cylinder sander to make it nice and flat, then trim the edges using my table saw and a sled. And then I add my usual chamfers on the top and bottom of the board for aesthetics. I then sand the faces down with 40, 80, and 180 grit sandpaper and pierce holes for the rubber feet. Then it's onto the CNC for a classic juice groove, and finally I can finish it up using linseed oil. The result is quite nice and sober. In retrospect, I shouldn't have put this in 7th place, maybe lower, but there are always things that you don't expect to happen that change the difficulty level as you go. Moving on to board number 8, this is actually something I've been wanting to try out for a long time. So first I use ash strips to make an ash-based board, and at this point it's necessary to join them this time because they're much wider strips, cut crudely on the table saw. I then sand down the board and take it through the table saw to split it semi-randomly in 2 places and glue it back with Sapelli strips to replace the gaps. Then I go back to the table saw and split it once more to get crossing lines and glue that too. The next step is to use my plug cutter to cut dozens of 16, 10, and 6mm plugs from ash, tigerwood, Paduk, and Sapelli. I then go back to my board and cut some holes in there for those plugs, and then glue them inside the holes and finally cut them off. I did it with a saw here, but I later used my chisels in the direction of the grain, which was much faster. For the Sapelli plugs that intersect the lines, they are intentionally wider than the rest. Once the glue is dry, I re-drill them with a smaller drill and add a small piece of ash inside them to make it seem like it's an empty circle rather than a filled one. Once all of that is cured, I take the board through my cylinder sander, trim the edges using the table saw, and add the usual chamfered edge and CNC cut juice groove to make it perfect. I finally add the holes for the rubber feet before oiling the board with linseed oil. The end result is a beautiful dotted board, and I absolutely love those Sapelli holes with ash inclusions. They just give it a little something extra. The final board is made with a 20cm ash base, and on the side I create a small 10cm board made with other woods, in this case Purple Heart, Tigerwood, and Paduk. Once all of the pieces are prepared for gluing by spending some time in that cylinder sander, I glue them up and sand everything down using the cylinder sander again and cut some strips of the same thickness as the board. The next step is to tape the 2 boards together and pass them through the bandsaw to make a random cut. Once complete, I separate the parts and switch 2 halves of each board and glue them with a Sapelli strip to separate them. I repeat the process 4 times to make many different weaving patterns, including one time where I didn't switch 2 halves and just added that Sapelli strip for aesthetics. In this case, I also cut a piece from the ash board to put on the other side because I want the woven pattern centered on the board. Then once that glue up is done, I do one final bandsaw cut through the center to add an extra Sapelli strip for aesthetics and glue all that together. The next steps are to plane the board down with a cylinder sander, add the usual features, so chamfer and CNC juice groove, and finally add holes for the feet and oil the board. The colors that are revealed by the linseed oil are beautiful, and the final result is a wonderful board woven with multiple species of wood that blend very nicely together. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in buying some of these boards, they are available on my website. Thanks for taking your time to watch this, and feel free to subscribe to watch the rest of this series.